The Memory of Kindness. Elder Vorath stood at the window of the ancient council chamber and watched the sky burn with fire and smoke, his forearms hanging limp at his sides as explosions lit up the horizon like terrible stars being born and dying in the same breath. And he knew that this was the end of everything his people had built over 10,000 years of peaceful existence on the world they called Velthara. The Dominion had come at last, just as everyone had feared they would, and now their warships filled the upper atmosphere like a plague of metal insects, descending upon a garden that had never known violence or war. And Vorath felt the weight of his years pressing down upon his thin shoulders as he turned away from the window to face the recording device that floated before him. He had a duty to perform before the end came, a final task that had been passed down through generations of Telvari elders, and that duty was to record the truth of their history, so that someone somewhere might remember what his people had been and what they had stood for in a galaxy that had grown cold and cruel. "I am Elder Vorath of the Telvari," he spoke into the device, his voice steady despite the fear that coiled in his chest like a living thing. "And I am recording this message because I believe that memory matters, that the choices we make echo through time long after we are gone, and that kindness is never truly lost, even when it seems that darkness has won." He paused as another explosion shook the building, sending dust falling from the ceiling like gray snow, and then he continued, because there was no time left for hesitation or doubt. 200 years ago, when I was not yet born, and my grandmother Merath led our people as High Elder, a young species called humanity reached out to the stars for the first time and made contact with the galactic community. And I want to tell you what happened next, because the galaxy has forgotten, but my people never did. Vorath remembered the stories his grandmother had told him when he was small, stories about the humans and their blue world called Earth, stories about their strange mixture of violence and compassion that confused and fascinated the other species who watched them take their first steps into the vast darkness between the stars. The humans had been so eager and so full of hope, Vorath remembered, building their first colony ships with primitive technology that the older species found almost amusing, sending messages of peace and friendship to anyone who would listen, believing with all their hearts that the galaxy would welcome them as brothers and sisters. And for a time, it seemed that they were right. As the Galactic Council granted them observer status, and trade delegations visited Earth to sample their strange foods and listen to their stranger music. And humanity began to dream of a future among the stars, where they would stand as equals, with beings they had once thought existed only in imagination. But then the plague came, Vorath said into the recorder, a terrible sickness that swept through the human colonies like wildfire through dry grass, killing millions in a matter of months, and spreading so fast that the scientists could not keep up with its mutations. And suddenly, the galaxy that had seemed so welcoming turned its back on the young species that had dared to reach for the stars. The Galactic Council held an emergency session, and Vorath had read the transcripts so many times that he could recite them from memory. And what those transcripts revealed was a cold calculation of self-interest that still made his heart ache with shame on behalf of beings he had never met. 27 species voted to quarantine Earth and all human colonies, cutting off all trade and communication and aid, leaving humanity to face the plague alone with their primitive medicine and limited resources. Arguments they made were always the same. The risk is too great. The cost is too high. They are too young and too weak to matter. Let them die quietly so that we may live safely. But 2 species voted against the quarantine, and one of them was the Telvari. High Elder Merath stood before the council and spoke words that would define the Telvari for generations to come, words that Vorath had memorized as a child, and that he now repeated into the recorder so that they would not be lost. "We will not abandon the humans," Marath had said, her voice calm and clear despite the anger directed at her from all sides. "Not because they can offer us anything in return, not because we expect gratitude or reward, but because the measure of a civilization is not how it treats those who can help it, but how it treats those who cannot. And if we leave these people to die alone, then we have already lost something more precious than safety." The council ignored her words and passed the quarantine anyway, but Marath did not accept their decision as final. And within a week, she had ordered 3 Telvari medical ships to travel to Earth, in defiance of galactic law, carrying doctors and scientists and agricultural specialists who were willing to risk their lives for strangers they had never met. Vorath's voice grew soft as he described what happened next. How the tiny Telvari fleet arrived in Earth orbit to find a world in chaos, cities burning, and governments collapsing, and billions of people crying out for help that would never come from a galaxy that had decided they were not worth saving. Commander Lisa Holloway of the United Earth Defense Force was the one who answered the Telvari hail, and the recordings of that first conversation had been preserved in the Telvari archives for 2 centuries, showing a human woman with exhausted eyes and a voice hoarse from shouting orders, staring at the screen as if she could not believe what she was seeing. "You came," Lisa had whispered, and then she had begun to weep, tears streaming down her face as she repeated those 2 words over and over. "You came. You came. You actually came." The Telvari ships descended through the atmosphere and landed at medical centers around the world, and for the next 5 years they worked alongside human doctors and scientists to fight the plague, sharing their knowledge of biology and agriculture, teaching humans how to grow food in the ruined fields that the sickness had left behind, never asking for payment or recognition or anything at all. And when the plague was finally defeated, Vorath said, his voice catching on the memory of stories he had heard since childhood, the Telvari delegation prepared to leave Earth and return to their own world, which had suffered economic devastation from the sanctions the Council had imposed as punishment for their defiance. Lisa Holloway came to see them off at the launch site, older now, and marked by the years of struggle. And she asked the Telvari captain a question that would echo through 2 centuries of history. "Why did you help us when no one else would?" The captain, a gentle soul named Keth, who had worked in the laboratories alongside human researchers, thought for a long moment before answering. "Because someone had to," Keth said simply, "and because we could, and because kindness is never wasted, even when it seems that way." Lisa pressed something into Keth's hands then, a small container holding a seedling from an oak tree, and she told him that it was a human tradition to plant trees for future generations, a promise that the shade they provided would shelter those who came after. "One day," Lisa said, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall, "if the Telvari ever need help, humanity will come, and we will not forget what you did for us when we were dying and alone." Keth had smiled and accepted the gift, imagining that 200 years later the promise would be tested. And Vorath looked out the window at the burning sky and wondered if that promise had been nothing more than the desperate words of a grateful woman who could never have imagined what the future would bring. The price of compassion. The years that followed the plague were difficult for both humans and Telvari, and Vorath continued his recording as the sounds of battle drew closer to the council chamber, knowing that he had to tell the full story even if no one ever heard it. The Galactic Council had not forgiven the Telvari for their defiance, and the sanctions they imposed were designed to punish and weaken a species that had dared to show compassion when compassion was forbidden, cutting off trade routes that had sustained Velthara for generations, and blocking access to technologies that the Telvari needed to maintain their civilization. High Elder Marath faced opposition from within her own government as the economic crisis deepened and food became scarce on a world that had always known abundance. And there were those who called her decision foolish and demanded that she apologize to the council and begged for forgiveness so that the sanctions might be lifted. But Marath refused to apologize for kindness, and she stood before her critics with the same calm dignity that she had shown before the council, telling them that some things were more important than comfort and safety. "We did what was right," Marath said in a speech that Vorath had memorized as a young student. "And I would do it again, even knowing the cost, because a people who abandon their principles when times grow hard have no principles at all, only convenient habits that they discard when they become inconvenient." The sanctions continued for decades, and the Telvari economy slowly recovered through hard work and careful management. But the scars of those years never fully healed, and there were many who wondered if Marath had been right, or if she had sacrificed her own people for strangers who would never remember their kindness. Meanwhile on Earth, humanity was rebuilding from the devastation of the plague, and they had not forgotten the Telvari, ships that descended from the sky when all hope seemed lost. A young Telvari scientist named Keth, the same one who had accepted the oak seedling from Lisa Holloway, had chosen to remain on Earth after the plague was defeated, working alongside human researchers to understand the biology of both species and to develop new medicines that could protect against future outbreaks. Keth worked in a small laboratory in a city called Boston with two human scientists named Nathan Cole and Samantha Gray, and together they spent years studying the plague and searching for ways to prevent it from ever returning, sharing knowledge and forming bonds of friendship that crossed the vast gulf between their species. Nathan was a quiet man with gentle hands and a sharp mind, and he had lost his wife and daughter to the plague in its early days, driving him to dedicate his life to ensuring that no one else would suffer as he had suffered. A laugh that could fill a room, and a stubborn determination that refused to accept defeat even when the research seemed hopeless. And she had been one of the first human scientists to welcome the Telvari when they arrived. Together with Keth, they made breakthroughs that would have been impossible alone, combining Telvari knowledge of alien biology with human creativity and determination. And slowly they began to understand not just the plague, but the fundamental connections between all living things. The cure they developed was not a single medicine, but a new way of understanding disease, and it spread across human colonies and eventually to other species who had once voted to let humanity die, saving millions of lives, including many who had supported the quarantine. But the Galactic Council gave no credit to the Telvari for their role in this achievement, and the official histories recorded that humanity had solved the problem alone, erasing the sacrifice of those who had risked everything to help strangers in need. Keth did not care about recognition or fame, and when the time came for him to finally return to Valthara after 20 years on Earth, he found it difficult to say goodbye to the friends who had become like family to him. Nathan Cole, now an old man with white hair and hands that trembled slightly when he worked, came to see Keth off at the spaceport, and he carried with him the same oak seedling that Lisa Holloway had given to the Telvari captain so many years ago. "I kept it alive all these years," Nathan said, pressing the container into Keth's hands with a smile that was both sad and grateful, "because I wanted you to have something to remember us by, and because I wanted you to know that humans never forget those who help us in our darkest hours." Keth looked at the small seedling with its tender green leaves reaching toward the light, and he felt something stir in his chest that he could not quite name. Warmth that transcended the boundaries between species and spoke to something universal and true. "What do you want in return for all that you have given us?" Nathan asked, echoing the question that Lisa Holloway had asked so long ago, and Keth gave the same answer that he had given then. Nothing, Keth said, because kindness given with the expectation of return is not kindness at all, but merely a transaction, and we helped you because it was right, and because we could, and because that is what we believe the universe asks of those who have the power to ease the suffering of others. Nathan nodded slowly, and then he made a promise that would echo through the generations that followed, a promise that humanity would pass down from parent to child, like a sacred trust. Then let me make a promise, without asking for one in return, Nathan said, that if the Telvari ever need help, no matter how many years pass, or how the galaxy changes, humanity will come. Stand with you, as you stood with us, and we will not count the cost, or ask what we might gain. Keth smiled, and accepted the promise, as he had accepted the seedling, never imagining that 2 centuries later, Nathan's descendants would be called upon to honor his words. The oak seedling was planted in Geneva, at the site that would become the United Earth Memorial, and it grew tall and strong over the decades that followed, its branches spreading wide to provide shade for the thousands of humans who gathered beneath it every year to remember the plague and the species that had refused to let them die alone. Children learned the story of the Telvari in schools across human space, and cadets at the Earth Naval Academy were taught that the first duty of a soldier is not to conquer, but to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And the example they were given was always the same: 3 small medical ships descending through the atmosphere of a dying world, because someone had to help, and the Telvari chose to be that someone. And on Velthara, Keth planted an earth oak in the central garden of the capital city, where it grew alongside the native trees as a symbol of friendship between 2 species separated by vast distances, but connected by something deeper than politics or trade. Vorath paused his recording as he heard the distant sound of Dominion troops entering the building, their heavy footsteps echoing through the halls that had known only peace for generations. He thought about Keth and Nathan and Samantha and all the others who had believed that kindness mattered, and he wondered if they had been right, or if the universe was simply cold and cruel and indifferent to the suffering of those who dared to hope for something better. But even as doubt crept into his hearts, Vorath continued recording, because the truth deserved to be told, even if no one was listening. The fall of Velthara. 2 centuries passed, like the turning of great wheels in the darkness of space, and the galaxy changed in ways that no one could have predicted when Keth planted his oak tree in the garden of the Telvari capital. The Dominion rose from the outer reaches of known space, a coalition of warrior species who believed that strength was the only virtue that mattered, and that peaceful civilizations existed only to be conquered and exploited. And they swept across the galaxy like a storm that consumed everything in its path. World after world fell before their advance, and the Galactic Council that had once seemed so powerful revealed itself to be nothing more than a gathering of cowards who would sacrifice anyone to preserve their own safety. The Corvani, the other species who had voted against abandoning Earth 2 centuries ago, were among the first to be conquered, their gentle civilization crushed beneath the boots of Dominion soldiers, laughed at their pleas for mercy, and took their children as slaves. And now the Dominion had come for Velthara, and Vorath knew that his people faced the same terrible choice that humanity had faced so long ago: to die alone while the galaxy watched and did nothing. He had sent messages to the Galactic Council, begging for help, reminding them of the treaties they had signed and the promises they had made, but the responses he received were always the same empty words, wrapped in diplomatic language that meant nothing. "We regret that intervention is not possible at this time," one message had said, "due to the complex political situation and the need to maintain stability in the region." Another had been more honest in its cruelty. "The Telvari have no military value and limited economic resources, and the Council has determined that the cost of defending Velthara exceeds any potential benefit." Vorath had read those words and felt something inside him grow. Cold. A bitter recognition that the galaxy had not changed since his grandmother's time. That the same species who had voted to abandon humanity were now voting to abandon the Telvari. And that kindness and compassion meant nothing to those who measured everything in terms of profit and power. The Dominion fleet arrived on a morning that had begun like any other, with the sun rising over the gentle hills of Velthara, and the people going about their daily lives in blissful ignorance of the doom that descended upon them. Vorath was in the council chamber when the alarms began to sound, and he watched on the screens as hundreds of warships emerged from hyperspace like predators emerging from the shadows, their weapons already charging as they took up positions around the planet. The Telvari had never been warriors, and their small defensive fleet consisted of only a dozen ships designed more for patrol and rescue than for combat. But the brave crews of those ships launched immediately to face an enemy that outnumbered them 50-1. The battle lasted less than an hour, and Vorath watched in silence as the icons representing his people's ships winked out one by one, each disappearing light representing hundreds of Telvari who died trying to protect their world. When the last defensive ship was destroyed, the Dominion commander broadcast a message to the planet below, and his face filled the screens in the council chamber with a smile that held no warmth or mercy. His name was Dravek, and he was a massive creature covered in thick scales and armed with teeth that could tear through metal, and his eyes glittered with the cold intelligence of a predator who had never known defeat. "People of Velthara," Dravek said in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder, "your fleet is destroyed, and your allies have abandoned you, and you have 1 hour to surrender unconditionally, or I will reduce your cities to ash and your people to..." Vorath turned off the screen and looked around the chamber at the other elders, seeing fear and despair in their eyes, but also something else, a quiet dignity that reminded him of his grandmother standing before the Galactic Council so long ago. "What do we do?" asked a young elder named Senna, who had been appointed only a few months ago, and had never imagined that she would face a decision like this. Vorath thought about all the things he could say, all the reassurances he could offer, but in the end, he decided that his people deserved the truth, even if the truth was terrible. "We cannot fight them," Vorath said, "and we cannot run, and no one is coming to save us. So we must decide how we want to face the end, whether we will surrender and hope for mercy from those who have shown none to others, or whether we will stand firm and refuse to bow, even knowing what it will cost." The elders debated for long minutes while the clock ticked toward Dravek's deadline, and in the end they reached no consensus because there was no good choice, only different kinds of defeat. Vorath was about to call for a final vote when Senna suddenly cried out and pointed at her communications console, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope. "Elder Vorath," she said, her voice trembling, "I am detecting a massive energy signature emerging from hyperspace on the far side of the system, larger than anything I have ever seen." Vorath felt his heart stop in his chest as he turned to look at the tactical display, watching as new icons appeared one after another, filling the screen with signals that the computer struggled to identify. "What is it?" he asked, though some part of him already knew the answer, some ancient memory stirring in his mind like a dream half-remembered upon waking. Senna's voice was barely a whisper when she answered, filled with wonder and disbelief, and something that sounded almost like prayer. "They are human ships," she said, "hundreds of them, the entire Third Fleet of the United Earth Navy, and they are transmitting a message on all frequencies." The main screen flickered and a new face appeared, replacing Dravek's cruel smile with something very different, a human woman with gray hair and steady eyes, and a uniform covered in medals that spoke of battles fought and won. "This is Admiral Kevin Marsh, of the United Earth Navy, the woman said, though Vorath realized immediately that despite the name, this was not a woman at all, but a man with features weathered by years of service. And I am here to deliver a message to the Dominion forces threatening Velthara. Dravek's face appeared in a smaller window, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion as he tried to understand what was happening. "Humans," he growled, "what business do you have here? This world belongs to the Dominion now, and you are far from your territory." Admiral Marsh smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Vorath's hearts begin to beat again. Something fierce and loyal and utterly unafraid. 200 years ago, the Admiral said, when Earth was dying and the galaxy abandoned us, the Telvari came, and they asked for nothing and expected nothing, and they simply believed that no one should die alone. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice rang with a conviction that echoed across the void between the stars. Today we are here to show the galaxy what humanity does with that kind of debt. And the answer is simple. We do not forget. We do not abandon our friends. And if you advance on Velthara, you advance on Earth. Vorath felt tears streaming down his face as he listened to the Admiral's words, tears of gratitude and wonder, and something else he could not name, something that felt like faith being rewarded. After centuries of patient waiting, the humans had come, just as they had promised, and Velthara would not die alone. H1. The Debt Remembered. Dravek stared at the tactical display showing the human fleet, and felt the first stirrings of doubt in a heart that had never known fear. But he crushed that doubt beneath the weight of his pride, and turned to face his officers with a snarl. Humans, he spat the word like a curse. A young species barely 2 centuries in space, with primitive technology, and no experience of real war. And they dare to threaten the Dominion? His officers laughed with him, their confidence bolstered by the memory of 100 conquered worlds, and the knowledge that no one had ever stood against the Dominion and survived. "All ships advance," Dravek ordered. "Destroy these humans, and show the galaxy what happens to those who interfere with Dominion business." The Dominion fleet began to move, hundreds of warships accelerating toward the human formation, with weapons charging and shields at full power. And for a moment it seemed that the battle would be over before it truly began. But Admiral Kevin Marsh had not brought the Third Fleet across the galaxy to lose. And he had spent months studying every report and every recording of Dominion tactics, learning their weaknesses and preparing strategies that would exploit them. "All ships hold position," the Admiral commanded from the bridge of the dreadnought Indomitable, his voice calm and steady despite the approaching storm. "Let them come to us, and let them think we are afraid." Captain Laura Vance stood at the helm of her strike carrier Relentless, watching the Dominion ships grow larger on her display, and feeling the familiar tension that came before every battle, the mixture of fear and excitement that she had learned to channel into focus. She had volunteered for this mission the moment she heard about it, as had every other captain in the fleet, because the story of the Telvari was taught to every human child, and because she had grown up dreaming of the day when humanity would repay the debt they owed. "All fighter squadrons ready for launch," Laura reported, her fingers hovering over the controls as she waited for the Admiral's signal. On the ground below, Commander Derek Hayes was leading the rapid deployment of human Marines to defensive positions around the Telvari civilian shelters. Working alongside confused but grateful Telvari officials who could not quite believe what was happening. "Keep the civilians underground," Derek ordered his troops. "And remember why we are here. Remember the stories your parents told you. Remember the 3 ships that came to Earth when we were dying." His soldiers nodded grimly and checked their weapons, ready to fight and die for a species they had never met, because their ancestors had made a promise, and humanity did not break its promises. The Dominion fleet closed to weapons range, and Dravek gave the order to fire, watching with satisfaction as hundreds of energy beams lanced out toward the human ships, expecting to see them shatter and burn as so many others had before them. But the human ships did not shatter, and their shields held against the first volley with a strength that made Dravek's eyes narrow in surprise. And then Admiral Marsh gave the order that changed everything. "All ships return fire," the Admiral said, "and show them what 2 centuries of desperate innovation can achieve." The human fleet erupted with weapons fire unlike anything the Dominion had ever seen. Beams and missiles and kinetic projectiles that tore through Dominion shields as if they were made of paper. And in the first 30 seconds of the engagement, a dozen Dominion ships exploded in balls of flame. Dravek roared in fury and ordered his fleet to concentrate fire on the human flagship. But the Indomitable danced through the incoming fire with a grace that seemed impossible for a ship of its size, its human crew working together with a coordination that spoke of years of training and a determination that bordered on madness. "They should not be this strong," one of Dravek's officers whispered, staring at the display as another Dominion cruiser vanished in a flash of light. "They are supposed to be primitives." But humanity had learned from their near extinction, and they had spent 2 centuries building a military that could never be caught helpless again, pouring their creativity and their stubborn refusal to die into ships and weapons that were designed to fight against impossible odds. Captain Laura Vance launched her fighter squadrons into the chaos of battle, leading them personally in a diving attack against the Dominion flagship, weaving through defensive fire with the skill of a pilot who had been born to fly. "For the Telvari," she shouted over the comm as her fighters unleashed their missiles. "For Nathan Cole and Keth and everyone who believed that kindness matters." The missiles struck the Dominion flagship in a chain of explosions that tore through its armor and left it bleeding fire and atmosphere into the void, and Dravek felt something he had never felt before as he watched his ship die around him. Fear. On the planet below, Derek Hayes and his Marines fought against Dominion landing parties that had managed to reach the surface before the battle turned, defending the civilian shelters with a ferocity that shocked their enemies. "Hold the line," Derek shouted as he fired his rifle at the advancing Dominion soldiers. "Not one of them gets through. Not one." A Dominion warrior charged at him with a blade that could cut through armor, and Derek met the charge without flinching, grappling with the creature in a struggle that ended when his combat knife found a gap in its scales. Human medical ships descended through the atmosphere even as the battle raged in orbit, their crews ignoring the danger to begin evacuating wounded Telvari from the damaged cities, echoing the actions of the 3 Telvari ships that had come to Earth so long ago. The battle lasted for 3 hours, and when it was over, the Dominion fleet was broken, scattered wreckage drifting through space as the surviving ships fled toward the hyperspace jump point with human fighters in pursuit. Dravek's flagship was crippled and burning, its weapons destroyed, and its engines dead, and the Dominion commander sat in the wreckage of his bridge and watched as a human boarding shuttle approached. Admiral Marsh stood at the airlock as his Marines cut through the hull, and when the breach was complete, he stepped onto the Dominion flagship with his sidearm drawn and his face set in an expression of cold determination. Dravek looked up at him from the floor where he had fallen, his scales scorched and his pride shattered, and he asked the only question that mattered. "Why?" The Dominion commander growled, blood dripping from wounds that would have killed a weaker creature. "Why would you sacrifice so much for a species that cannot offer you anything in return?" Admiral Marsh holstered his weapon and looked down at the defeated warlord with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. "Because they did the same for us," he said simply, "and because that is what humanity does with kindness. We remember it, and we repay it, and we pass it on." Dravek tried to respond, but the words would not come, and as human medics moved in to treat his wounds, he found himself wondering if perhaps the Dominion had misunderstood something fundamental about the nature of strength. The battle was over, and Valthara was saved, and across the planet Telvari civilians emerged from their shelters to find human soldiers standing guard in the ruins of their cities, ready to help rebuild what had been destroyed. Vorath watched from the council chamber as the last Dominion ship fled into hyperspace, wept tears of joy and gratitude and wonder as he realized that the promise made 2 centuries ago had been kept. Humanity had come, just as they said they would, and they had not counted the cost. The oak tree. The days that followed the battle were filled with the difficult work of recovery, as humans and Telvari labored side by side to clear the rubble from the streets and tend to the wounded who filled the medical stations that had been set up throughout the capital. Vorath walked through the ruins of his city with Admiral Kevin Marsh at his side, stepping carefully over broken stones and twisted metal, while human soldiers helped Telvari civilians search for survivors beneath the collapsed buildings. The oak tree that Keth had planted in the central garden 2 centuries ago still stood, its trunk scarred by fire and its branches stripped of leaves, but alive, despite everything that had happened around it. Vorath stopped before the tree and reached out to touch its bark, feeling the rough texture beneath his fingers, and thinking about all the years it had grown here, a symbol of friendship between 2 species who had chosen kindness over convenience. 1. It survived, he said softly. Everything else is destroyed, but the tree is still standing. Admiral Marsh smiled and looked up at the bare branches reaching toward the sky like arms raised in prayer. Humans have a saying about oak trees, he said, that they grow strong because they weather every storm, and that their roots go deep because they have faced the wind and refused to fall. They stood in silence for a moment, 2 beings from different worlds connected by a thread of history that stretched back through generations. And then Vorath asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the human fleet first appeared. "Why did you come?" he asked, turning to face the Admiral with eyes that held both gratitude and confusion. "You owed us nothing. The agreement our ancestors made had no legal force, no binding contract, nothing that required you to risk your lives for us." Admiral Marsh was quiet for a long moment. His voice was thick with emotion that he did not try to hide. "Do you know about Nathan Cole?" he asked. And when Vorath nodded, he continued. "Nathan was one of the scientists who worked with the Telvari researcher Keth during the plague years. And when Keth left Earth, Nathan gave him a seedling from an oak tree, the same tree that Lisa Holloway had given to the first Telvari delegation." The Admiral reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph, yellowed with age and creased from being handled many times, showing an old man standing beneath a massive oak tree with his arm around a young girl. "That seedling was planted at the United Earth Memorial in Geneva," the Admiral said, "and it grew into one of the largest oak trees on Earth. And every year, on the anniversary of the day the Telvari ships first arrived, humans gather beneath its branches to remember." He handed the photograph to Vorath, who looked at the smiling faces and felt something stir in his heart. "The girl in the picture is my grandmother," Admiral Marsh said, "and Nathan Cole was her great-great-grandfather. And when she was young, he told her the story of the Telvari and made her promise to pass it on to her children." Vorath looked up from the photograph with understanding dawning in his eyes. "So the promise was kept," he said, "passed from parent to child across the generations." "Every human child learns about the Telvari in school," the Admiral confirmed. "And the first lesson every cadet at the Earth Naval Academy receives is the story of 3 small medical ships that defied a galaxy to help strangers. And we are taught that this is what it means to be human, not the conquering or the fighting, but the standing with those who need us." A human woman approached them then, her uniform marking her as a scientist rather than a soldier, and she carried a small container in her hands that she held with great care. "Vorath," she said, bowing her head in respect, My name is Claire Bennett, and I am a xenobiologist who has spent my career studying Telvari agricultural methods, the same methods that once saved Earth from famine. She opened the container to reveal a small seedling with tender green leaves, and Vorath recognized it immediately, even though he had never seen one before. This is an oak seedling, Claire said, grown from the same tree that stands in Geneva, the tree that Nathan Cole planted 200 years ago, and we have modified it carefully so that it can survive in Telvari soil. She held out the container, and Vorath accepted it with trembling hands, feeling the weight of centuries in that small vessel. "We wanted you to have this," Admiral Marsh said, "as a symbol of the bond between our peoples, and as a promise that what happened today was not a one-time debt being repaid, but the beginning of something new." Vorath looked at the seedling, and then at the damaged oak tree behind him, and then at the humans who surrounded him, soldiers and scientists and medics who had crossed the galaxy to stand with strangers, because their ancestors had made a promise. "What do you want in return?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Surely there must be something." Admiral Marsh shook his head and smiled, and when he spoke, his words echoed across 2 centuries of history. "Nothing," he said, "because kindness given with the expectation of return is not kindness at all. And because the measure of a civilization is how it treats those in need, not those who can offer something back." Vorath recognized the words, variations of the same message that High Elder Marath had spoken before the Galactic Council, and that Keth had spoken to Nathan Cole, and that had been passed down through generations of both species like a sacred trust. "Your grandmother taught you well," Vorath said, and for the first time since the Dominion arrived, he felt something like hope stirring in his hearts. Together, they walked to the center of the ruined square, where the old oak tree stood surrounded by rubble, and Vorath knelt down and began to dig a hole in the soil with his bare hands. Human soldiers and Telvari civilians gathered around to watch as the Elder of Velthara planted the seedling beside the tree that Keth had planted so long ago. 2 symbols of friendship growing side by side in the heart of a city that had nearly been destroyed. When the seedling was planted, Vorath stood and looked around at the crowd that had gathered, seeing faces of both species mingled together in a way that would have seemed impossible just days ago. 200 years ago, Vorath said, his voice carrying across the silent square, "My grandmother made a choice to believe that kindness matters, that helping those in need is more important than safety or profit or the approval of those who lack the courage to do what is right." He paused and looked at Admiral Marsh and Claire Bennett and all the humans who had come so far to stand with his people. "Today humanity has proven that she was right," Vorath continued, "and they have shown the galaxy something it had forgotten, that loyalty and gratitude and compassion are not weaknesses to be discarded when times grow hard, but strengths that bind us together across the void between the stars." He turned back to the small seedling beside the ancient oak, 2 trees that would grow together for centuries to come, their roots intertwining beneath the soil as their branches reach toward the same sky. "Let this tree be a reminder," Vorath said, "that kindness is never wasted, that promises matter, and that no one who stands with others in their darkest hour will ever stand alone in their own." The crowd began to cheer, humans and Telvari together, their voices rising into the sky where the stars waited, silent witnesses to the moment. Beginning of something new. And in Geneva on Earth, beneath the oak tree that Nathan Cole had planted 200 years ago, the news spread across the human worlds, and billions of people wept with pride and joy as they learned that the debt had been paid and the promise had been kept. Vorath completed his historical record that night, but it was no longer a eulogy for his people, and instead it became the first chapter of a new story, one that began with kindness and was repaid with loyalty, and would continue for as long as humans and Telvari remembered what they had given each other. The galaxy watched in silence as two species, bound not by treaties or trade, but by simple compassion, demonstrated something that the cold calculations of politics and power could never understand. That the smallest act of kindness can echo across centuries. That promises made in gratitude are the strongest promises of all. And that sometimes the measure of a civilization is not the wars it wins, but the friends it refuses to abandon.